Today, Friday, 2nd August, what might have been the most consequential news in the world is not in the field of geopolitics, but in the area of the US economy. Apparently, a jobs report has proved disappointing, in fact, severely disappointing on the downside, and there appear to be concerns that weeks before the United States is due to hold elections, the US economy might finally be sliding into recession. Markets, I have to say, financial markets for some weeks have been looking edgy, and this latest jobs report appears to have added to the worries. And in fact, there's also been a significant sell-off in the financial markets over the course of today. There's also some talk of interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve Board coming in order to try to prevent a recession over the next couple of weeks, or indeed at all. I'm not going to comment about that. All I would say is that, as I understand it, inflation is still above the Fed's target. And if they are forced to start cutting interest rates at this point, well, presumably that would be a sign that they're very nervous about the situation indeed. Now, all of this has just come shortly after confirmation that the United States, that its sovereign debt level has now reached $35 trillion, which I believe exceeds the size of US GDP. Well, there we are. We will see what happens. All I will say is, I'm not going to discuss this in detail. I mean, we've had lots of words and talk in recent months about the United States going into recession, about the accumulating problems in the US economy. We've discussed them extensively, Alex Christoforou and myself in the Duran. I've always been of the view myself that the period of economic growth that many have been talking about, which has happened over the course of the current administration, was a lot less impressive than it looked. I've always been of the view that it is almost entirely a product of the very, very heavy deficit financing by the administration, which has, of course, been what is causing, one of the factors which is causing debt to rise. And, well, all I will say is I've just read these comments about the state of the US economy in the Financial Times. It says that to take the above expectation economic growth figures for the second quarter, the 2.8% annualized rate was taken as evidence that the US economy is in fine fettle. But dig deeper and you see the flaws. Government spending, backed by a hefty deficit, has helped prop up growth. We've been saying that on the Duran, well, for months now. And, well, there it is. It's now in the Financial Times as well. I want to make it very clear, by the way, that we were not, of course, the only people who have been saying it. You'll find lots of others who have been saying it as well. But shall we say that you probably wouldn't have found such a straightforward admission of the fact in the Financial Times until recently. And then, by the way, to continue, the Financial Times goes on to say jobs have been bolstered by a public sector hiring spree. What about consumer expenditure? Break it down. And the largest spending contributions come from essentials such as rents, utilities, health and food, rather than discretionary stuff. So the spending spree is largely a product of inflation, higher costs in essentials, not discretionary spending, people going out and spending money on things they want. It's more a case of people spending money on things they need to have. And we're told that nonetheless, consumption growth is outpacing income as well. Seemingly strong numbers belie a weaker underlying economy. Well, as I said, if it all comes apart in the next few weeks or months, it will, of course, have an impact on the election. It will also, by the way, have a very, very significant impact on the international, global, geopolitical situation. But one lesson I've learned is never to anticipate events in economics. We'll have to wait and see whether it is indeed the case this time that the United States really is tipping into recession. Whether the spending boom, the government spending boom of the last couple of years has now run its course, and whether the problems that this boom has created have finally come home. Whilst I'm on that topic, by the way, it's always interesting to me to see how people talk about a government spending boom in Russia and explain that as the reason for the faster growth of the Russian economy over the last 3 years, and ignore the very much bigger, both absolutely and relatively, spending boom, government spending boom, that has been happening in the United States. Moreover, it's probably fair to say that the spending boom in Russia, though it's had aspects of increasing wages and salaries and wages of people, for example, serving in the armed forces, but much of it has been geared to actual infrastructure spending and investment spending as well. That has been much less the case, or so it seems to me, in the United States. As it happens, and coincidentally, we got some more economic figures coming out of Russia yesterday. The most interesting was about the Russian GDP. We're told that Russian GDP growth in the first half of 2024 came in at 4.7%, higher than in 2023. So 4.7% growth. The economy, as of the 1st of July, was 4.7% bigger in GDP terms than it had been on the 1st of July 2023. But even more interesting, at least more interesting for me, is the fact that though statistically growth appeared to slow in June it was 3% higher than in June 2023, which is less than in any preceding month on a statistical basis. The interesting point is that, in fact, growth in June came out 3%, output in the economy came out 3% higher in June than it was in June last year. I say that because, of course, it was in June 2023 that the current Russian economic boom began. It was in June 2023 that the Russian economy began to speed up. In fact, growth started to happen, with, all cylinders, surging. And given that we are comparing June 2024 with the high growth numbers for June 2023, it is interesting that the economy in June 2024 grew 3% above that number. I think that the central bank, by the way, is right, that we're probably likely to see growth of around 4% this year in the economy. This despite the fact that the central bank recently increased interest rates in order to try to bring the inflation numbers down. Inflation, by the way, over the last few weeks in Russia has begun to fall and began doing so before the latest interest rate increase. And that we are still in a period of expansion. We've also got from the PMI numbers, the PMI index for July is 53.6, which is points to considerable expansion. Again, I suspect the reason why it is below the 54.9 points in June is because monetary policy began to tighten in July, culminating in the eventual announcement of the increase in interest rates. It's likely that the economy, the Russian economy, will slow significantly in the second half. That, of course, is the intention of the central bank. That's what they are trying to achieve in order to bring inflation down. I suspect that they will do it. The interest rates will slow the economy and inflation will start to come down. But I still think, more likely than not, we're going to see growth, overall growth in 2024, come in at around 4%. So there we go. Story of completely different economies. And just to reiterate again, the very last figure I saw for Russia's federal budget deficit was that it was just 0.5% of GDP. And if you actually unscramble the numbers, yes, there has indeed been an increase in spending by the government in the economy since the start of the special military operation. But it is not as big proportionately as many people think. And as I discussed in a recent program, the major reason for the economic growth in Russia over the last couple of years lies elsewhere, in the spaces created in the economy by the sanctions, the departure of foreign businesses, by the retention within Russia, the ending of capital flight or capital exit because of the sanctions as well, which means that there's suddenly a huge amount of money within the economy that is looking for routes to invest. The explosion in demand as a population, which has had to endure varying levels of austerity, going all the way back to the 2014 crisis. They began to spend heavily starting in June last year. And lastly, and I discussed this at length in a recent program, softer monetary conditions organized by the central bank as they try to get the economy moving again after the initial reaction to the sanctions. Anyway, no more about this. We will see what happens in the American economy, but it is something to keep in mind, obviously, if the economy falls into recession between now and the election. That will affect the election outcome, and it will also have a marked effect on the overall geopolitical situation. But as to how things will play out exactly, both in the markets and in the real economy, well, that remains to be seen. What I will say is that a major crisis in the Middle East of the sort that we seem to be hurtling towards is absolutely the last thing anybody in the United States should want if they are concerned about overall economic stability. And, well, the situation in that respect continues to deteriorate, or at the very least be incredibly tense. What exactly is going to happen, what the Iranians intend to do in response to the various steps that the Israelis have taken over the last couple of days, well, we still must wait and see. But I noticed that yesterday the Iranians came out and directly accused the United States of complicity in the assassination in Tehran of the political chief and, by the way, chief negotiator of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. The head of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence, Ismail Khatib, has now come out and said that the United States knew in advance about Israel's plans to assassinate Haniyeh and allowed them to be carried out, which in effect makes the United States, according to the Iranians, complicit in Haniyeh's killing. Now, I ought to say that I don't know what information the Iranians have to say that, whether they've managed to penetrate either the US or the Israeli governments and are familiar with the consultations that take place between Israel and the United States, or whether Ismail Khatib is simply guessing, or whether it's an attempt by the Iranians to somehow excuse the major failures in their security systems, which made possible Haniyeh's killing. But the point is that Khatib has now said this. He speaks obviously with the authority of someone who heads at least one of Iran's many intelligence agencies. In other words, he speaks, to some extent at least, officially for the Iranian government, and that means that the Iranians, in theory at least, should be responding to the United States as well as to Israel itself. To repeat a point I have made many times, but I think it's perhaps useful to make again, sending an armed man across a country's border is an act of war. Having that armed man take violent action in the other country is doubly an act of war, and carrying out a political killing in the other country is, legally speaking, potentially an act of war as well. Obviously so. Anyway, let's just take a step back and discuss a little more about the killing of Ismail Haniyeh. Now, yesterday I pointed out that, however you look at it, the killing of Haniyeh is a major blow for the United States. That President Biden and the administration have been trying over the last few weeks to broker a ceasefire in Gaza, or at least that is what they have been saying. President Biden has actually made comments to the effect that a ceasefire is on the brink of being agreed by Israel and Hamas, and that the negotiators of the two sides have been working within a framework of a ceasefire which was drawn up by the administration, by the United States. And as the Emir of Qatar, who has also been playing a mediation role in these negotiations, and who is the head of the ruler of Qatar, which hosts Hamas and bankrolls it, and who has also, as I understand it, played a significant role in the negotiations. As the Emir of Qatar has now just complained, it makes absolutely no sense to pretend that one is conducting a negotiation in good faith if one then goes ahead and assassinates the chief negotiator of the other side in the way that the Israelis have done. Well, the United States, which has been sponsoring those negotiations, if it really was working with the Israelis or allowing the Israelis or giving the green light to the Israelis to assassinate Haniyeh, then it was acting in a way that completely contradicted the public words of the US president. And people like the Emir of Qatar if they come to think that, will be furious and extremely mistrustful of the Americans in future. Or if, as I still tend to believe, despite what the Iranians are now saying, that the United States is not actually involved or party to this killing, then all I can say is that the Israelis have demonstrated in the most brutal way to the Americans that they're not interested in the ceasefire that the Americans have been trying to persuade them to agree to, and that they will not let the United States influence their decisions. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly spoiling for a fight at the present time, as is the Israeli government that he leads, and as is a significant section of Israeli society, have, with this assassination, made it absolutely clear to the administration, an administration that they no longer take seriously, that they're going to do exactly what they choose, that they're not going to let the president or his advisors or his foreign policy team bounce them into a ceasefire that they do not want. Now, in saying all of this, we've now had a lot more information as to how exactly it was that Haniyeh was assassinated. And it is extremely interesting. It seems that the theories that Haniyeh was killed by a missile were wrong. It does appear as if he was killed by a bomb. And the bomb, we are told, this is an article which appeared in the New York Times, and which, by the way, must have drawn on Israeli sources, a fact which, again, confirms Israel's involvement in this assassination. Anyway, the New York Times tells us that this bomb was inserted into this building where Haniyeh met his end, a building which was known to be under the control of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps sometime 2 months ago, and that the bomb has been there all this time waiting for an opportunity to be activated and to kill whoever it was who was inside this building. Now, if this is true, and of course we don't know for a fact that it is true, then that provides some very interesting information. Firstly, to repeat a point I've now made many, many times, but I think it's worth making again. If a bomb can be inserted into a building of this nature, which is controlled by Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, then this was a massive breach of security. It would suggest that the Israelis have in some way managed to infiltrate the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and that they've been able to get round the security of a building like this, and not only plant a bomb inside it, but do so in a way which meant that this bomb was not detected in the many weeks since it was placed where it was. That's one thing. The second is that if this did indeed happen 2 months ago, then a number of very interesting facts start to suggest themselves. Just over 2 months ago, on the 19th of May to be precise, Ebrahim Raisi, the former president of Iran, died in a helicopter crash. And there was a period of considerable confusion and uncertainty in Iran. Perhaps this is the time when the Israelis took advantage of that uncertainty to plant the bomb, who knows. But beyond that, the Israelis would have known that under the terms of the Iranian constitution, elections would happen. And they would also know that whoever won the elections, there would be an inauguration ceremony, and that guests from around the world would be invited. So it rather looks as if they planted this bomb in anticipation of this event. I'm saying this on the assumption that the Israelis knew in advance that this particular building was used by the Revolutionary Guards Corps to host various people that would be likely to attend the ceremonies involving the inauguration of the new Iranian president. And it must be said again that highly likely that amongst those people, since we're talking about a building run by the Revolutionary Guards Corps, those sort of people would either be militia leaders, people from Hezbollah, people from the various militias, pro-Iranian militias based in Iraq, or conceivably someone like Haniyeh. Just saying. Because they're the kind of people who would be more likely to be in contact with the Revolutionary Guards Corps and who would be invited by the Corps to Iran, and for whom the Revolutionary Guards Corps would assume security once they were in Iran. So, planning to assassinate someone starting 2 months ago in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the death of Ebrahim Raisi, planning to assassinate someone close to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, who it would be anticipated would come to Tehran and who would stay in this very same building where the assassination of Haniyeh took place. Now, all of this planning initiated by Israel directly after the exchange of missile strikes between Israel and Iran, which took place in April of this year. You can see the sequencing, and it is suggestive. It suggests that even as the Americans were working hard, or so they said, to try to calm the atmosphere in the Middle East, even as the Americans were brokering deals whereby the exchange of missile strikes by the Iranians and the Israelis would be of, shall we say, a moderate nature, if that's the right word. The Israelis were already busy planning assassinations of senior people inside Iran. And again, I ask the question, did the Israelis actually inform the United States of this? Did they inform the President of the United States of any of this? And, of course, the New York Times article does confirm that when the Israelis found out that Haniyeh was in the building, they made the decision to detonate the bomb, presumably by remote control. Did they discuss this with the United States before doing so? Did they speak to the White House about it? Was the president informed? Did Prime Minister Netanyahu make any attempt to inform the president? I ask those questions because, as I said, if the president wasn't informed, then he was massively snubbed and humiliated by the Israelis in the way that this was done. Anyway, one way or the other, this event, assuming that this story in the New York Times is true, one way or the other, it looks as if, even though Prime Minister Netanyahu did not get his wider war in April after the Israeli missile strike on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus, as soon as America's attention was turned away, the Israelis were busy already planning assassinations inside Iran, which they must have known would risk the kind of crisis and escalation that we see play out now. So all this is very interesting. As I said, again, to make it clear, I'm putting pieces together in the jigsaw. I can't pretend that I'm sure that the jigsaw is exactly right. I'm not sure, for example, that the story is even true, that the bomb really was planted 2 months ago. It might have been planted much more recently, which would, of course, beg a whole different set of questions. But assuming that this story is true, which perhaps it is, then, as I said, it does point to a determination by Israel, or at least by the current Israeli government, to seek escalation, to continue to seek escalation in the Middle East, and in particular, to seek a crisis in the Middle East against Iran. So, in the aftermath of all of this, we're now getting reports that the United States, that the US Defense Department, the Pentagon are now busy diverting aircraft and missiles and doing all the same things that they did in April to protect Israel from the pending Iranian missile strike. A missile strike by Iran that they appear to expect is coming. Far from taking any public step, either to criticize the Israelis or to warn them not to do this again, or do anything of that kind, they are rushing to do the same thing that they did in April, which is protect Israel from the coming Iranian response. Now, the flaw in this strategy, in the light of all that I have said, is obvious. Going back to April, the United States worked very hard, the Europeans also worked very hard to get the Iranians to exercise restraint, which the Iranians did, and the Americans were telling everybody that the one thing they did not want was a general war in the Middle East. But of course, they have not acted in any way to persuade the Israelis to exercise restraint, and the Israelis have now made it absolutely clear that they have no intention of exercising restraint. As I said, if the story in the New York Times is true, the Israelis were already busy planning the next escalation just weeks after the attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus. They might have been thwarted in their objective to get a wider war then, but it seems that they were still seeking a wider war immediately after, and have gone on doing so since. And as I've discussed, now that there is a power vacuum in Washington, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government seem to be intent on taking advantage of it. And yet we have American policy being exactly the same as it was in April. It seems that the Americans don't quite get the point that though the Iranians can, up to a certain degree, be persuaded to exercise restraint in these crisis situations, the Israelis have just indicated in the most public and brutal imaginable way that they have no interest in restraint, self-restraint whatsoever. In other words, once this affair is ended, assuming that there is an Iranian missile strike and assuming that this time the United States as last time, is able to shoot down most of the drones and most of the missiles. They might not be so successful this time. Maybe the Iranians will go for a more ferocious response than they did back in April. All the indications are that they will. Anyway, let's assume that the Iranians behave the same way as they did in April. Well, in a few weeks' time, we'll be back in exactly the same position, because the Israelis, knowing that they have the Americans behind them, knowing that the Americans are incapable of restraining them, and clearly seeking a wider crisis in the Middle East, are going to do something which, if not exactly the same, is intended to have a similar effect. Some other assassination attempt, some other missile strike, some other bomb attack, something else which will bring us closer to this war in the Middle East. And as I said, it seems incredible to me that no one is talking about this. No one is mentioning the fact, at least as far as I can tell amongst Western governments, that it is not Tehran that needs to be given the lectures about exercising restraint. Iran has shown every desire to exercise restraint ever since the events of the 7th of October. The party that needs to be given those lectures, and not just lectures, but firm warnings backed by diplomatic action to show exercise restraint, is Israel. And until that happens, as I said, this whole situation is going to just continue and recur. Now, to reiterate again, especially given these latest economic numbers, I am at a complete loss to understand why anybody in the United States, anybody in the current administration, would want a war in the Middle East. A war in the Middle East which might disrupt the supply of oil, raising energy costs, and a war in the Middle East which might have effects against American citizens who find themselves there, I would have thought is the very last thing that the administration would want in advance of the elections. That, I would have thought, was another reason, or reason enough, for the administration to do that which they have many times said that they are going to do, which is to have a full and frank discussion with the Israeli authorities and tell them once and for all to stop. Whether the Israelis, aware of the administration's problems, would have any interest in heeding that is another matter. I would still expect the administration at least to try, but for the moment, they don't seem to be even up to doing that. I've discussed the extent to which we're looking at a vacuum of power at the present time in Washington, and you can see the effect. The American government, the US government, is functioning on autopilot, even as the situation in the Middle East is escalating and in serious danger of getting out of control. Anyway, we'll see what happens and how things play out over the next couple of hours or days. To reiterate again, the American media have told us that Iran has gave itself a 72-hour timetable before they responded. We only have the Americans' word for that. I've been checking the Iranian media, or at least the English language Iranian media, which is, of course, intended for foreign readers. I've not seen any reference there to any 72-hour time limit, but we'll see exactly what it is that the Iranians are going to do. They have promised retaliation, and I am sure it will come. Now, before I conclude with this, there is something further I wanted to say. I've talked about my own deep disapproval. Well, I've talked about how sending armed men across a country's borders and having them commit assassinations in those other countries in terms of international law is a classic act of war. And this is where I'm going to come to the topic of this big exchange of spies and political prisoners or detainees, if people want to accept that view. I'm not challenging it, by the way. This big exchange of journalists and people like that has just taken place between the Russians and the Americans, and which is involved, by the way, a whole number of other countries as well. And of course, the people that everybody is talking about, most at least in the United States, are Gershkovich and Whelan. They're both back in the United States. The administration has been very committed to bringing them back. But we can see that the Russians drove a very hard bargain indeed in order to get these people back. And one of the people that the Russians got back is a man called Krasikov, who is alleged by the Germans, he's convicted by the Germans, of having carried out an extrajudicial killing of a Chechen separatist leader in Germany. Now, the interesting thing about Krasikov is that the Russians, making no attempt, in effect, to deny that he did carry out that killing, and that he was acting on this occasion on behalf of the Russian authorities. In fact, as I understand it, they've just confirmed that Krasikov is a member of the FSB. Now, there have been many allegations of the Russians conducting assassinations in all sorts of places. Mostly, I have to say, the evidence has been thin. And, well, we all know the cases, and I'm not going to discuss them. One case, which I examined in very great detail, which took place in Britain in 2006, I am actually confident that the Russian authorities were not directly involved. But I've always preserved an open mind about all of the others, and I've always said that I'm pretty sure that the Russians are quite capable of acting ruthlessly when they feel they have to. And, well, this was an example when they did. So one should not be under any illusions about this. And I should make it very clear that for my own part, sending men across borders to do this sort of thing is something that I do not like at all. As I said, I think it is a major violation of international law. But I've always been aware of the fact that it happens, that all the great powers do it to a certain degree, and I've never had any illusions that the Russians were any sort of exception. However, I do have to make one quick observation. I've noticed there have been all sorts of rather judgmental statements across the media about Krasikov, calling him a hitman and all of that, which, I'm not saying that he is not, but sort of implying that extrajudicial killings of this kind are the kind of horrible thing that the Russians do. Well, as we've seen, they do it. But we have a major crisis in the Middle East because, of course, the Israelis also do the same thing. And they've been doing it for decades. They didn't just start doing it after the events of the 7th of October. They've been doing it basically ever since the State of Israel was founded. And no one in the West has ever seemed particularly bothered about the fact. Indeed, there have even been films about Israeli teams that go out and do these things, and they've been feature films, and, well, it's often talked about and discussed, and nobody seems to be at all worried about it. I have to say, I don't find that at all strange, but it's something to keep in mind when people get onto their soapbox and start pontificating on these sort of things. A Western country, or a country aligned with the West, does it. The other side certainly does it too. Everyone does it. And that's the reality of the modern world. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this particular exchange. As I said, I don't like to talk about these things. It is interesting that this has all been agreed, but my own view is that though governments were involved, and President Putin and some of his top officials came to meet these Russians who were returning, as the Russians said, to the motherland, I've no doubt that this was mostly negotiated between the various intelligence agencies of the various countries involved. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this affair. Well, there we are. These are the big events, if you like, over the last 24 plus hours. There have been important developments on the Ukrainian side. And I just wanted to mention something which was said yesterday in a program on the Military Summary channel, which I think might have been true, and which was suggestive. The Military Summary channel made the point that this is a major exchange of people from many, many countries which has just taken place. Russia and the United States were involved, but so were other countries too. But Ukraine itself was not involved. And the Ukrainians have perhaps some cause to feel that they've been left out. And it could be the case that these photographs of F-16s that we've seen in Ukraine flying around over Lvov and in the skies somewhere over Ukraine, though it's impossible from the photograph that was released to make any judgment as to where the photograph was taken. Anyway, it could be that the Ukrainians circulated all of these stories simply because they felt annoyed that this affair, this event had taken place, this exchange had taken place, and they wanted to get themselves back in the news again. And I have to say, I think that's entirely plausible. Anyway, what has actually been going on in Ukraine over the last 24 hours, or at least going on in the war? Well, the news is that the situation for Ukraine on the battlefronts is not just getting worse, it is becoming critically worse. Now, we've had a number of very interesting reports from the Russian news agency TASS, and the reports are attributed to a source which TASS refers to by the name of defense circles. Now, this is very Soviet language. If you are familiar with the way in which, the old Soviet media used to operate, you would often have articles which appeared, especially in Pravda, as I remember, in which they talked about how, such and such an event was taking place around the world, and senior Soviet circles were concerned about this, and then we'd have a statement of the Russian position or disclosure of certain information without actually identifying the specific individual or individuals who were providing that kind of information. Now, when that was done in the old days of the Soviet Union, this mechanism, referring to, senior, highly placed circles or whatever it was, always indicated an authorized leak. And information that had come directly from the government itself, and which the government wanted to be published in the media, in the Russian media, and wanted to be published in a way that a foreign audience, foreign analysts, people like Ray McGovern, whilst he was working in the CIA, would notice. Or at least that was always my impression. And well, here we have the defense circles doing the same thing. For TASS, clearly this information comes, I'm guessing now, from the Russian General Staff. And, well, they're telling us exactly what's going on, or at least they're telling us some things about what's going on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, the very fact that they're doing this in this way suggests that we are indeed approaching a point of crisis. Anyway, one report reads as follows, and it says this: a part of the Ukrainian combat group near the settlement of Zhelanne in the Pokrovsk area has been trapped by Russian troops in a pincer movement, defense circles told TASS on Friday. Enemy units in the Zhelanne area are already trapped. Ukrainian troops are sustaining heavy casualties. The Ukrainian army grouping in that frontline area is actually encircled, and the enemy has been driven out of the flanks. So this is what we've been told. And as I said, I strongly suspect that this information comes ultimately from the Russian General Staff. And this isn't the only thing that the defense circles are telling us. They also tell us something else. And this relates to the situation in Vuhledar. The Russians, of course, refer to Vuhledar by its Russian name, which is Ugledar. We might very soon be using that in preference to Vuhledar. It's been pointed out to me that Ugledar is easier for a Westerner to pronounce than the Ukrainian name, Vuhledar. But anyway, let's just read what TASS has to say about this. It says that Russian troops have placed a key Ukrainian supply route in Ugledar in the Donetsk People's Republic under full gunfire control of their artillery, defense circles told TASS. The route leading from Ugledar to the settlement of Konstantinovka has been cut off. Russian assault units are successfully conducting assault operations in the community, from where they now keep a key transport hub used for the Ukrainian army's supplies in Ugledar under full gunfire control, the defense circles said. The route also includes country roads, the defense circles specified. Now, we've actually had information from the front lines, from the usual mapping agencies and reporters and bloggers and all of those people, which actually essentially confirmed this information. Now, we've had, I can start with the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar. Film has now been released by a Russian drone, which shows this road. Almost completely deserted. There was one knocked out armoured vehicle on the road, but you could clearly see the Russian flag flying on it. And in fact, it appears that the Russians not only have fire control of the road, but they've actually physically occupied it in several places, and they've pushed beyond the road also in several places. I believe that this has been true for about a week, but the Russians are now in effect confirming it. So it looks as if the road has now been cut, and cut conclusively. I would make the further point that the defense circles, the Russian military, in other words, also tell us that the route that's been cut also includes country roads. So there's the main road, which has now been cut, the road from Vuhledar to Konstantinovka, the T0524 highway, to give it its proper name. It's an asphalted road. The pictures of it show that it's a relatively small road, but anyway, it is there. It's a proper asphalted road, straight as an arrow, by the way. But the Russians also say that countryside roads have also been cut as well. And given that they're talking about gunfire control, I wonder whether that means the road further west, which is not so far from road T0524, whether what has happened is that the Russians have not only crossed the T0524 highway, but have come close to reaching the other road to the west, which is, as I understand it, a smaller road, and that road has been cut also. Now, if that is correct, then the situation in Vuhledar has become critical. Vuhledar is not completely cut off from supplies, but its supply routes have become very precarious. And to be frank, with the Russians moving ever larger forces into position around Vuhledar and also gradually advancing in the area of the Vremivka salient, which is relatively close to this region, to this town of Vuhledar, I can't help but think that a major attempt by the Russians to encircle and trap the Ukrainian soldiers in Vuhledar is now probably just a week or so away. Again, this battle is progressing much faster than I expected and than I think anybody expected. Ukrainian resistance in this area is proving much weaker than it has been at any point previously in this war. And if I can just complete what I'm saying about the fighting in this area, we're also getting reports that the Russians have now, in effect, encircled Konstantinovka, the village of the other end of the T0524 highway, the village through which that highway passes on its way to Vuhledar. That the Russian troops are to the north, south and east of it, that they're bombing Konstantinovka round the clock, that they've established themselves in some parts of the eastern sections of Konstantinovka. And, well, the reports, the messages which have been published by the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian army, which is trying to defend Konstantinovka, are becoming more and more urgent and more desperate. It's looking as if Konstantinovka itself is on the brink of being stormed. Something which, well, it's a fairly big village, about the same size as Novomikhailivka, a little to the west. If Konstantinovka collapses, then it will be a sharp contrast to the months-long battle for Novomikhailivka, a battle of which lasted, as I remember, around 6 months. So anyway, looks as if, well, we have corroboration, as I said, from the reporters and bloggers and mapping projects, that what the defense circles are telling us is actually true. Now, this is all very serious, but arguably the information from the defense circles about the encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Zhelanne is even more dramatic. And we haven't quite had information to this effect from, as I said, the bloggers and reporters and all of those people about this, but we have had quite a lot of information about what's going on in Zhelanne, and it strongly suggests that this is correct. Now, to repeat, Zhelanne is a large village in the area, in the Ocheretino area. The Russians have been advancing on this village ever since they captured the village of Progress. There is a railway line that leads from Progress southwards towards this village, and the Russians have apparently been advancing along this railway line towards Zhelanne. The Russians, about a week ago, also captured another village called Novoselivka Persha, which lies to the south of this area. It's to the south of the villages of Yevgenivka and Sokol, which lie to the west of Ocheretino. And this village of Novoselivka Persha lies almost exactly to the east of Zhelanne. Now, a couple of days ago, we received reports that Russian troops had advanced towards Zhelanne and had occupied, or at least had reached, the cemetery to the northeast of this village. But early this morning, or late last night, reports came through that Russian troops advancing from Progress, advancing along the railway line, had managed to capture the railway station, Zhelanne railway station as well. Now, that would mean that the Russians are also at the western tip of this village. So it could be the case that there is indeed, in effect, an encirclement of Zhelanne, that the Ukrainian troops in Zhelanne are essentially trapped, that they are trapped by the Russians who occupy the cemetery to the northeast, the railway station at the very southwestern end, and who are probably also in the process of advancing towards this village of Zhelanne from the east, from the recently captured village of Novoselivka Persha. And it's also been claimed that there are Ukrainian positions, trenches and that kind of thing, located between the villages of Novoselivka Persha and Zhelanne. And of course, if Zhelanne itself is in effect encircled, then it looks as if those troops in those fortified positions between Novoselivka Persha and Zhelanne might have been trapped as well. Now, it's all very sketchy, and one suspects that an awful lot more is going on here than the mappers and bloggers and reporters and all of those people are aware of, that the situation is in fact developing again extremely fast. I would make one further point. A couple of days ago, we were hearing lots of stories about how 2 battalions of the Ukrainian army had allegedly been trapped in a cauldron between the villages of Progress and Lozovatska. And I made the point many times that the Russians themselves never mentioned anything like this. They never said that they trapped Ukrainian troops in this area between Lozovatska and Progress, and that the whole story seemed to me to have been basically invented, mostly by these troops themselves, in order to excuse the fact that they'd fled from their positions between these two villages of Progress and Lozovatska in disobedience of orders that they stand firm. Now, on this occasion, by contrast, the Russians, and not just the Russian mappers and bloggers and all of those people, but defense circles, in other words, someone within the official Russian military, is actually reporting that a Ukrainian force has become encircled. Well, we will find out what exactly is happening. But this does look like it's important news. We'll see how real it is. We'll see what the Ukrainians do in order to try to escape this cauldron, which the Russians say they have established. And anyway, it does look as if the days of Zhelanne as a village under Ukrainian control are ending. And as I've discussed in previous programs, if Zhelanne is captured, the Russians are well positioned to cut the supply lines between the Ukrainian defenders of Karlovka, a village to the south, and Mirnograd by cutting the main roads, and that they're also well positioned to begin an offensive towards the town of Selidovo, which is one of the advanced Ukrainian logistic bases in this area of Donbass. Anyway, that's one set of fairly dramatic events that are playing out in the this area in the Pokrovsk area, the area west of Avdiivka and Ocheretino, and increasingly close to Pokrovsk itself. But there's been actually a lot more. We've been getting news over the last couple of hours that the Russians, having now captured the village of Veselye to the south of the TO51 road, which is the road from which basically starts in Ocheretino and goes through Progress. And if you go along this road westwards, you eventually get to the big crossroads village of Grodivka, and then beyond Grodivka, you eventually arrive at Pokrovsk and Mirnograd themselves. Anyway, the Russians were reported yesterday as having fully captured the village of Veselye, which lies immediately to the south of this road. Reports are now coming through, and they are fairly detailed, that the Russians have now captured a significant part of the village of Ivanivka, which lies immediately to the north of this road. So it looks as if the Russians intend to advance up this road towards Grodivka and to attack Mirnograd specifically from the south. And intense fighting apparently going on for Ivanivka, but again, no one seriously doubts that the Russians are indeed going to capture Ivanivka. But we also have reports that having captured the village of Timofeevka, which lies to the northwest of Lozovatska and to the west of the large village of Novo-Alexandrovka that the Russians also captured some weeks ago, that the Russians have actually started an offensive towards two other villages to the west of Timofeevka. One is a village called Lizichne, which lies between Ivanivka and Timofeevka, and the other is the village of Sviridonovka. And I have to say, I am a little surprised about this. I'd assumed that with Timofeevka captured, the Russians will be wheeling northwards, focusing northwards, and would finally begin their operation to storm the village of Vozdvizhenka, which lies immediately to the south of the Pokrovsk-Chasov Yar highway. But anyway, they haven't so far begun that operation. Instead, they continue to press westwards. There is, by the way, another village called Yelizavetivka, a little to the west of Vozdvizhenka, which is actually even closer to this road than Vozdvizhenka itself is. The road in question being the TO 504 road, to give it its proper name, the main supply road. So it looks as if all kinds of things might be happening, and it might be that after capturing Sviridonovka, the Russians will move north towards Yelizavetivka. If they, of course, capture Yelizavetivka, as well as these other villages, then Vozdvizhenka is in effect encircled, and the Russians will have presumably little difficulty capturing this village as well. Anyway, there we are. A crisis, a major crisis developing in this area of the battlefronts. Now, according to a number of reports that I've now seen, the Russians are now reinforcing their grouping, their military grouping in this area to the west of Ocheretino and towards Pokrovsk. And there's reports that a division of the Russian army, the 27th Division, which, as I understand it, is a regular army division. I believe it's a mechanized division, so it has tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, is now moving towards this area of the battlefronts. Probably around 10,000 men in total, reasonable guess. And as I said, a large and powerful force altogether. And it looks as if the Russians are acting on the principle that you reinforce success. And they've achieved astonishing success precisely in this area. And the commitment of an entire division of the Russian army reinforces my view that the Russians are now indeed heading for Mirnograd and for Pokrovsk. So a major battle is looming over the horizon for Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have shown no ability to slow the Russians down. The Russians reinforcing, and as I said, a major battle is on its way. Now, there's another major battle which has been underway for some weeks now, but which has also been developing very fast, and this is the battle for Toretsk. Now, reports were starting to appear yesterday that the Russians have finally and fully cleared the village of Zalizny to the south of Pivnichny. I discussed in my program yesterday that they seem to be encircling one of the coal mining positions close to this village. But there's also reports that the Russians have been making very, very significant advances to the east of New York, that they have pushed the Ukrainians back considerably there. There were some pictures, some maps rather, I should say, which show a huge new area of New York, which appears to have passed under Russian control. And, well, I understand that the gap between the forward Russian positions in New York and the Russian positions in Zalizny is now no more than 3 kilometers, an area which can be easily covered by artillery and mortars and even anti-tank missiles. So any Ukrainian troops that still located between New York and Zalizny are in effect encircled. It's difficult to know whether there are any Ukrainian troops there. I've heard it suggested that there's 2 battalions of the Ukrainian army there, which, well, would be several hundred men. Who knows? But anyway, it looks as if another cauldron is indeed beginning to emerge in the Toretsk area as well. And of course, the Russians are getting closer now to storming Toretsk itself, to beginning the attack on Toretsk itself. Now, there's a lot of things going on in other places. There are reports that in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region, the Russians, the group of forces north, as I've said, has been making more progress in the area of the high-rise buildings. Apparently, the Ukrainians have attempted various counterattacks in the Volchansk area. It doesn't seem as if any of these counterattacks have so far been successful. A couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians made a major effort to recapture the village of Gluboka, north of Lipsy. That attempt ended in a disastrous failure. I'm not going to discuss the fighting in Volchansk in any more detail in this program, because I don't know what exactly is going on there, but it does seem as if the Russians aren't steadily but slowly gaining ground in the area of the high-rise buildings. And I'm going to guess that eventually, when Ukrainian defences in Volchansk collapse, as happened in Avdiivka in February, the collapse will be sudden. Overall, the story continues to be of Russian advances, of the Ukrainians unable to hold the Russians back, the Ukrainians short of men and machines, and the Russians having unlimited, well, not unlimited, but more than sufficient numbers of both in order to continue their offensive. As I said in previous programs, there's been various comforting claims that in the summer the Russians will run out of momentum. There's even some talk of the Ukrainians going on the offensive themselves somewhere, in some place. There's lots of hopes pinned on what the F-16s are going to do. But the realities on the ground point to continued Russian advances. And to reiterate again, if these important places start falling, we are now past the point of the major fortified lines. The Russians have broken through the big fortified lines that the Ukrainians created in Donbass after the fighting in 2014. If towns like Pokrovsk fall, if Chasiv Yar falls so that the Russians are able to move further and attack the town of Konstantinovka, 70,000 people, and capture it, well, we are going to stop seeing this slow, incremental war that we have seen for so long and which we have become so accustomed to. I suspect that at this point, the tempo will accelerate and we will start to see many more places starting to fall into Russian hands at much higher speeds. And the whole character of the war will change. And at that point, even as they might be struggling with a recession in the United States and a war in the Middle East, I'm not saying that either of these eventualities are certainties, but they might be. There's a high possibility that they could be. Even as the West finds itself struggling with a recession, bear in mind, Germany already looks to be on the brink of recession. If the United States falls into recession, the new Labour government in Britain is going to be in major recession. And in France, well, the political situation is in chaos. Heavens knows how the French will deal with a recession situation in the United States. Anyway, with signs that we could be on the brink of a recession in the United States, with the possibility of a war in the Middle East, causing a spike in oil prices and all sorts of other things, one wonders whether the current crop of Western leaders have the bandwidth, frankly, to deal with yet another crisis in Ukraine. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish the program today. As I said, I've been discussing a program that we did with Theodore Postel. I gather that this is about to be published. I'm going to wait until it appears before I comment on it in these programs. Anyway, this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can support our work. You can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and the others, Rockfin, all of those others. We are, by the way, considering focusing on American election news, doing programs specifically on locals to cover American election news. We haven't yet made a definite decision to that effect, but if we do, I will let you know. And anyway, please also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can check out our shop, links under this video also. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.